It's an honor for me to introduce our keynote speaker, the second one for the conference, Professor Michael Dawson, whose Race and Capitalism initiative at the University of Chicago has been one of the inspirations for this conference and has also seeded a range of initiatives on racial capitalism in campuses across the country. Professor Dawson is the John D. MacArthur Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, where he serves as the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. His research interests have included the development of quantitative models of African American political behavior, identity and public opinion, the political effects of urban poverty, and African American political ideology. This work also includes delineating the differences in African American public opinion from those of white Americans. More recently, he has combined his quantitative work with work in political theory. He's the author of numerous books, including Behind the Mule, Race and Class in African American Politics, which came out from Princeton in 1994, and Black Visions, The Roots of Contemporary African American Political Ideologies, which came out in 2001 and has won multiple awards, including the prestigious Ralph Bunche Award from the American Political Science Association. He followed up Black Visions with Not in Our Lifetimes in 2011, which examines the weakness of Black politics in a much more complicated political and racial context, and also Blacks in and Out of the Left in 2013, which looks at two of the most significant periods of radical Black insurgency in the 20th century. He is currently working on reflections on Black politics in the early 20th century and an edited volume, Fragmented Rainbow. His strong interest in the impact of information technology revolution on society and politics, as well as his research on race, are both fueled in part from his time spent as an activist while studying and working in Silicon Valley for several years. He has also served as the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago, and among other duties, he was elected to the board of the Social Science Research Council and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2006. He has been interviewed extensively by the print and broadcast media, including in the Washington Post, The Economist, the LA Times, the New York Times, NPR, CNN, etc. Professor Dawson is also a regular commentator at theroot.com. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Dawson.
Thank you so much, Susan. I would like to thank Susan and the organizers for all the support to get me here. It was a prodigal effort on their part to do so, and for the invitation to share some thoughts with you. I would also like to thank those who have gone before us, who have been fighting to prevent the theft of their lands, against racial capitalism, against the degradation of nature. This is very much a work in progress. It's a mess. I'll say that now. Most of my career has been centered through analyzing the mistakes of my generation's movements, including spending a lot of effort, as Susan suggested, trying to understand how Black folks and others viewed key political, social, and economic issues, as opposed to assuming we knew what people thought, which we did a lot in the movement, or at least we assumed we knew what they should think. Blacks in and Out of the Left was a work in that same mode, trying to figure out what went wrong, what went right. And it was particularly a critique of those who argue that the so-called particularism of the Black movement, the Chicano movement, the indigenous movements, and the women's movement were responsible for the failure of the left, a view I utterly reject. I think the work on racial capitalism has laid a lot of the basis theoretically, for that rejection. What I want to do today is, for the first time, critique that a lot of my close colleagues and comrades have had of my work is that I talk a lot about the past, but not much about the future, about where do we go from here, to quote King, or what is to be done, to quote some Russian. That's a valid critique of my work. And I'm thinking, this paper is trying to think through some of the problems we will face going forward, and maybe don't have any answers, but maybe some ways to think theoretically and pragmatically about where do we go from here. So some on the right, from the very early days of my work, accuse me of being part of the racial doom and gloom industry, as they put it. But in some ways, I'm an optimist. Today, I present early thoughts on how a race and capitalism lens might help us think through conflicting just claims that might emerge under a social democratic regime. That's where the optimism comes in. One totally random note. I'm having a little trouble breathing, so if I start talking too fast, tell me to slow down. The multiple capitalist crises the U.S. faces today are a result both of the inherent contradictions found within a capitalist social order and from frictions and contradictions arising out of its articulation with two other systems of domination, those of patriarchy and white supremacy. These crises have generated within the U.S. extreme right-wing populist movements, which are part of a global populist revolt of the right, as well as progressive social movements in black communities, among immigrant communities and their allies, and against those corporate and state forces responsible for the deadly acceleration of climate change and many other struggles as well. Many within the left, such as theorists Nancy Fraser and Rahel Yagi, have argued that deep structural transformations are the only way to end the injustices and predations of the current financialized capitalist social order. Structural transformations that most likely would lead to minimally a new, more robust social democratic order, something we've never seen in this country, or perhaps a fully socialist society. This has been a stance taken by many within black radical movements since the early 20th century, and it's once again being seriously debated within the radical youth movements of this decade. As I actually forgot I had slides. As the quotation suggests, many have argued that socialism minimally means the collective allocation of social and, and economic surplus. Yet there are also substantial frictions and potential conflicts brewing between progressive forces and movements on how a social democratic or socialist regime would address these multiple demands that are emerging out of today's social movements. When I was an undergraduate, I was a leader of my local black student union. My job could more or less be called, I was a diplomat that tried to negotiate between other allied movements. And I remember a very tense moment, and the campus I was on had not seen many black students before we got there in our hundreds. And the right-wing forces shot at black students. This is elite university, by the way. They tried to burn down the dorms of black women undergraduates. So there was it was at the height of the Black Power movement. There was a very strict reaction by elite white students that they didn't want us there. But in the midst of that, there's also tensions between progressive forces on campus. I remember negotiating with a militant Chilean woman who was an undergraduate as well, both of us trying to keep the Black Student Union in the mecha from a situation developing that could have been quite explosive. We were successful. But at the time, I think we thought that a lot of those types of conflicts were anomalous, but they're not. The different processes of dispossession, of genocide, of enslavement and slavery, of conquest, generate different demands, different rights, different needs for justice, and potentially conflicts among them and how they get resolved. A democratic socialist or socialist regime would have to determine how to, for example, this is just one example, adjudicate between black and other historically racially oppressed populations' demands for reparative justice and sovereignty, and the demands of many environmental activists, particularly in the global north for zero or severely limited growth. In this talk, I'll first outline the framework my colleagues and I have been developing for the analysis of what many of us have called racial capitalism in our work. This framework is preliminary, and we are working through, among ourselves, serious theoretical and political questions, some of which we disagree on. So I'm not going to burden any of them. If you have critiques, direct them at me. They would agree with you. Second, for the purposes of highlighting potential conflicts that could emerge within a social democratic politics, I'll establish the basis for the demand for restorative or reparative justice campaign to address the injustices derived from the historical and contemporary oppression and subordination of blacks in the U.S. Third, I'll show how these demands could come into conflict with other just demands, such as the need to reverse the depredations on the environment that were greatly intensified by modern industrial and then financial capitalism. Here I'll provide just one example of the conundrums that a new order would face. I argue that a policy of zero growth makes racial reparative justice projects much more difficult, as any redistribution of wealth and other resources would have to come from existing stocks and not necessarily fueled in part by a regime of growth. Fourth, I would discuss some possible ways to resolve the major political and moral questions that would face any new social democratic or socialist order. I'll suggest some theoretical and political approaches to help us think through how to address these types of conflicts. And if there's time, I'll conclude with a call for us to analytically, normatively, and politically examine how these the processes of expropriation, dispossession, genocide, and exploitation of peoples and the planet are linked, and that we must develop language, practices, and movements that not only respects the differences in the historical processes, but also moves us toward gaining justice for all who have been oppressed and dispossessed in the past and present. I start with outlining our developing framework. Black theorists of an earlier generation were clear on the, in other words, in my generation, we're clear on the centrality of both capitalism and anti-blackness that was central to a global system of white supremacy, to an understanding of black oppression, particularly oppression in the most disadvantaged sectors of blacks in the US. Dan Berger reminds us that the Black Panther prison leader, George Jackson, centered the racial oppression of blacks and capitalism in his scathing call to combat white supremacy and a capitalist social order. Jackson declared, quote, "The economic nature of racism is not simply an aside. Racism is a fundamental characteristic of monopoly capitalism," unquote. Du Bois, many decades earlier, came to the same conclusion when he concluded, quote, "Whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever. Amen," unquote. I picked that out of one of our colleagues in this room's book. Here I introduce a preliminary framework for analyzing the interaction of white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. The foundation of the approach was laid in my and Megan Francis's essay, Black Politics and the Neoliberal Racial Order. In that essay, we argue that the white supremacist racial order changed over time as how racial domination was maintained through the interaction of civil society, the economy, and the state. This analysis has been further extended in an article co-authored with Emily Koschenstein, Articulated Darkness, White Supremacy, Patriarchy, and Capitalism in Shelby's Dark Ghettos, to be published this June in the Journal of Political Philosophy. That article focused on what we call regimes of articulation. A regime of articulation is historically specific articulation of capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. Slavery in the US represented one such regime of articulation. And it usually takes a massive event or rupture to transform any specific regime. Historically, these regimes became established with the trend crimes of the global dispossession and genocide of indigenous peoples, and enslavement and commodification of African bodies through the slave trade. One of the structuring elements of white supremacy was and is anti-blackness, Horton Spillers argues. quote, for all intents and purposes, the politics of melanin, not isolated in its strange powers from the imperatives of a mercantile and competitive economics of European nation-states, will make of transcendence and degradation the basis of historical violence that will rewrite the histories of modern Europe and Black Africa, unquote. The articulation of white supremacy and patriarchy had different consequences for white and black women and white and black men in this context. For example, Spiller notes, quote, what confuses and enriches the picture is precisely the sameness of anonymous portrayal that adheres tenaciously across the division of gender. In the vertical columns of accounts and ledgers, the term Negroes and slaves denote a common status, unquote. The articulation of all three systems of domination are particularly pronounced during slavery as birth and reproduction are transformed into as she continues, genetic reproduction becomes then not an elaboration of the life principle in its cultural overlap, but extension of the boundaries of proliferating properties, to the extent that the captive female body locates precisely a moment of converging political and social vectors that mark the flesh as a prime commodity of exchange. As Walter Dawson and other historians have noted recently, slaves were the main form of capital in the United States. And indeed, by 1860, in Johnson's recent Boston Review article, he notes that the value of slaves at that point was greater than that of all manufactured products, all agricultural products, and the land combined within the U.S. Violence by the racial state, by slave owners, and by any white person who so chose was the glue that ensured that the terror and exploitation and expropriation continued uninterrupted. All three systems of domination intersected to define the content of gender and race. All three were reinforced by the racial state. They held any act of violence by a white person against a slave justifiable. Of course, this could be extended to those of Mexican descent in the Southwest and indigenous people throughout the Western Hemisphere. As Hartman argues, how can we discern the crime when it's a legitimate use of property? However, it's important that the decriminalization of rape not be understood as dispossessing the enslaved of female gender, but terms of differential production of gendered identity, or more specifically, the adequacy of meaning of gender in this context. Therefore, what is at stake here is not maintaining gender as an identitarian category, but rather examining gender formation in relations to property relations, the sexual economy of slavery, and the capitulation of injury, unquote. This is an excellent example of how the articulation of systems of domination produce a regime of articulation within a specific era. The libidinal economy is important to understand and analyze, cannot be fully understood without simultaneously understanding the political economy. The political and libidinal economy of slavery was structured and protected for all of the contemporary brutality, as well as that which occurred during Jim Crow, is not the same as the monstrosity that marked the regime of articulation set by slavery, although what we have today and what we had during Jim Crow was certainly also monstrous, but in different forms with different mechanisms. Fred Moten explains in some detail what we call regimes of articulation. His view is where this insight has its immediate political application is to the series of practices articulated through race, class, gender, and sexuality. Each of these words points to a systemic structuration that appropriates different forms of surplus through racism, exploitation, sexism, and homophobia. By extending a productionist model to domains not generally associated with an economy or oriented toward exchange, I want to take seriously Marx's understanding of capitalism. He treats it as is forcibly constituting by the very organizing boundaries it erects, and then transgresses pursuit of increasing magnitudes of surplus, the global collectivity, the combination due to association that he understood as the socialization of labor. The race, class, gender, and sexuality as the very materiality of social identity are also produced in the process indicates the practical generativity, the ongoing social capacity to render life as history, necessary for any cultural product. Therefore, it's not that a production approach assigns race, class, gender, and sexuality the same history, political effects, or practical means. Instead, this approach is attempting to imagine a context for critical analysis that would grant these four articulating structures, historicity, politics, and practice, in relation to one another, that is, in a manner that is mutually recognizable. Saidiya Hartman provided an excellent analysis of how the racial state adjusted to change from the regime articulation that marked the passage from slavery to Jim Crow. Although no longer the extension and instrument of the master's absolute right or dominion, Hartman states, the laboring black body remained a medium of others' power and representation. If the control of blacks was formally affected by the absolute rights of property in the black body, dishonor, and the quotidian routine of violence, these techniques were supplanted by the liberty of contract that spawned debt peonage. I think we're going to be hearing much more about debt pretty soon. The bestowal of rights that engendered indebtedness and obligation, and licensed naked forms of domination and coercion, and the cultivation of a work ethic that promoted self-discipline and induced internal forms of policing. Spectacular displays of white terror and violence supplemented these techniques. I would note that this violence was generated during Jim Crow and now, not only by the racial state, but by white civil society as well. During the period of the latter's preferred form of anti-black violence was lynching. The passage does an excellent job of demonstrating the end result of the reorganization of both capitalism and white supremacy within the US, a reorganization that produced a new regime. Emily Katzenstein and I argue in the forthcoming article that I mentioned the following. We say that we contend that these systems of domination develop semi-autonomous logics. While white supremacy and patriarchy often are functional for capitalist economies, for example, they can also come into conflict with the logics of capital and generate tensions, crises, and contradictions. One example can be found in the book that was mentioned yesterday, Race and Class in the Southwest by Mario Barrera, where the logic of capital was to keep Chicano and Chicano workers in the Southwest as an underpaid labor force. But the logics of white supremacy, as they played out in the unions that were all white, was not to have a labor force that was paid less, but to exclude that labor force entirely from the workforce. And the union won. Workers of Mexican descent were expelled from that industry for a while. So sometimes the logics will produce conflict with each other, although more often we see the case that they reinforce each other. There are at least two key ways, of course, in which the white supremacist and capitalist order have been mutually reinforcing. First, white supremacy has been mobilized both in order to safeguard or maximize profitability, as well as in order to mitigate economic crises and distributional conflicts. Social democracy in Western Europe, and to some degree, to a lesser degree in North America, was certainly fueled to some degree by the expropriation of land, labor, and profit from the colonies. Racial hierarchies have also been mobilized in order to secure entry into markets, to redistribute property, both by legal means, by means of extra-legal violence, and maximize profitability in capitalist markets. As I.D.B. Wells and many other late 19th and early 20th century black activists and writers documented, the naked violence of Jim Crow from both the state and white citizen was used to dispossess black individuals and communities. This occurred through brutal violence, including lynchings and pogroms, such as the 1921 attack on Tulsa, Oklahoma's black community, as well as confiscation and fraud. Less visibly, the racial state has often backed and been the main guarantor of racial segmentation of markets, including those of housing, labor, and credit markets, which has led to the super-exploitation and heightened precarity of black and brown labor. Barrera has argued that black and brown labor forces were particularly vulnerable, not least because they were often excluded from organized labor during the 20th century, and thus constituted a segment of the population to be used as disposable reserve army. This reserve army could be laid off easily during a slack economy and paid substandard wages when employed. Barrera, of course, considered the Chicana and Chicano labor force of the Southwest to be a colonial labor force, and one that shared many similarities with black labor during the 20th century. These logics separately and as articulated pressure points, produce pressure points. Some will benefit the capital, as I've argued, others that provide political possibilities for progressive movements. And they are most often seen, these pressure points, during times of crisis as we are in today. And which political forces benefit is highly contingent on the historical context and the strength and organization of progressive forces. For example, the series of crises that began in the 1960s and we're seeing culminating again in our time are usually thought to be the result of strife between labor and capital, as Michel Freiherr, Greta Krippner, Wolfgang Streeck, and others have argued. And yet I would argue they are more properly understood as being the result of the global and domestic, at least with respect to the US, articulation of white supremacy and capitalism. Globally, the anti-colonial struggles and domestically black and allied insurgency that occurred from the 1950s to the 1970s put pressure on both capital and the racial state, which is also, of course, a patriarchal state. On capital, as newly independent countries were to some degree, at least initially able to renegotiate terms of trade, in some cases, such as with oil, with dramatic effects on the global economy. Domestic black insurgency demanded an end to discriminatory markets, thus also cutting into, as did some gains won by the women's movement, into domestic profits. The pressure on the racial state occurred as the state had to manage the successive waves of crisis of capital, so well described separately by those such as Greta Krippner and Wolfgang Streeck, but also within the US had to manage demands for increased state spending as a result of the demands of multiple social movements, particularly the movements of people of color. The state's task of managing racial conflict was made much more difficult as growing segments of whites across classes began to resent black gains in particular and resisted state efforts to address black demands. This, of course, is what produced both the silent majority, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and ultimately Donald Trump. The culmination, which is global in nature, can be seen by the current crisis of capital throughout the global north. Declining standards of living combined with popular movements that have overtly racist components. Yet we simultaneously increase mobilization in the US of black radical and allied and other movements that are mounting sometimes very successful challenges to both white supremacy and the predations of racial capital. Adopting articulated systems of domination framework helps us theorize the contradictions that aid and hinder progressive political mobilization as a result of partially conflicting sets of privileges and oppressions that in turn help us explain historically contingent patterns of conflict and cooperation. We therefore regard the articulated systems of domination approach as a framework that allows us to think politically about the obstacles and pressures to which emancipatory movements for racial and economic justice will likely be subject. It calls for the analysis of the current articulation of patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism in order to identify weak points in their mutual articulation that makes gains from emancipatory movements possible. A regimes of articulation approach also lays a foundation for historical and contemporary claims of justice, although this is not the only framework that does so. We don't make that claim, of course. This frame helps us identify both the systemic roots of the systems of domination, as well as the beneficiaries of both the past and contemporary injustice that results of this articulation. It's not just the bourgeoisie or the capitalists, of course, are the beneficiaries. All who came as and were brought here uninvited are also implicated. In addition to the settler colonialists and foreign trade, plantation extraction enterprises that benefited from the original dispossession, genocide, and enslavement, what became the backbone of financial capital, such as the large British and American insurance companies, also benefited, and they made profits from insuring not only the slave trade, but slaves as well within the U.S., as Michael Ralph's work shows us. With the constitution of black oppression under Jim Crow, there are benefits that not only accrued, as Du Bois and many, many others pointed out, to firms, financial institutions, and capitalists, but to some sectors of white civil society as well. As we know all too well, many universities benefited, not only from the dispossession of the land, but from the slave trade, and during the 20th century, what was euphemistically called Negro removal. My own university is no exception. It's been long known on the south side of Chicago for the bulldozing of black neighborhoods. And recently, strong evidence has been produced that it was founded in part on the proceeds from a large Mississippi slave plantation. It has, of course, resisted all efforts to discuss or even jointly investigate these claims. All of us, not just insurance companies and universities that were built on stolen land and bodies, are responsible for entering a process that claims of justice derived from dispossession, conquest, genocide, slavery, and the aftermath are addressed. And even within a liberal egalitarian framework, reparations, or at least minimally a reparative justice campaigns, are justified. For example, Shelby in his book, Dark Ghettos, argues principles of rectification should guide attempts to remedy or make amends for injuries and losses victims have suffered as a result of ongoing or past injustice. Yet there is intense hostility of whites and the racial state to reparations or even apologies for past racial injustice. This hostility was documented originally in a public opinion article in a 2004 Du Bois Review article by Ravana Popoff and myself that showed a massive public opinion gap on reparations and apologies for slavery, Jim Crow, or even, as later analyses showed, the survivors of the early 20th century pogroms of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Rosewood, Florida. This analysis has been updated in a forthcoming book chapter, and the data we have on reparations and apologies covers the period from 2000 to 2017. As you can see, the massive chasm in public opinion remains. Now I can go back to my original comfort zone of playing with numbers. So in the initial set of studies from 2000 to 2005, you can see that there is massive, I used to joke, but it wasn't funny, that I knew all 4 white people that supported reparations in the United States. But on a much more serious note, regardless of whether you ask about Jim Crow or reparations, 9 out of 10 white Americans oppose reparations. And it doesn't change much when you try to limit the scope of what reparations is about. This question only asks about reparations for the descendants and victims of Tulsa and Rosewood. So this is not a general program. This is a very specific one. And still 9 out of 10 white Americans opposed reparations during this period of 2000-2005. Now, my colleagues were very unfair. They said that you're a specialist in public opinion, Michael. Well, yeah. And then they said, you know there's no variation among white people when it comes to the support for reparations. Yes. Why are we still asking this question? So we didn't ask it. And we started concentrating instead on a question that had more variation. But even when you ask about an apology for slavery, and you can see the data from 2000 to 2017, massive amounts of the white population is opposed to even an apology for slavery and reparations. While among the Asian population, the Latinx population, and of course the black population, there is moderate to, well, at least for blacks, very strong support for at least an apology. Now, this is not specific to just an apology or reparations for black people. In the original 2000 study, we also asked a question about apology and reparations for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And a majority of all people of color, very strong majorities, supported both reparations and apologies for citizens, Japanese American citizens who have been interred. But a large majority of whites opposed both an apology and reparations for Japanese Americans. There is an element of anti-blackness, though, we should not lose. We also did a survey experiment where we first asked a question about, in half the surveys, we asked a question about blacks first, and the second one, we asked a question about Japanese Americans first. If we asked a question about the lack of support for reparations for black Americans, didn't change regardless of where we put the question. But if we put the black question first, it drove down support for Japanese Americans. So anti-blackness then became sort of like this toxic that undermines support for other people of color in the United States. So there is a specific quality to anti-blackness that's part of white supremacy. It's not I'm not an Afro-pessimist. It's not the total of white supremacy, but it's something that we need to theorize and take into account politically. The racial state, of course, has been as hostile toward reparations. For this audience, I won't bore you with all the regressions we did. It'll take an hour, and I'll get way too happy. The racial state has been, I'll say one thing about the regressions. My senior colleague has induced me. What I will say is that it's a methodological and epistemic point. One of the things we do in political science and to some degree sociology way too much is we'll put all people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds into one group and then run equations. That's wrong. I mean, that's absolutely wrong. What we found when we ran equations separately, that the reasons people support or oppose reparations or apology are very different across groups. There are different histories that are reflected in those equations. So as a methodological and epistemic point, it's much more important to understand what's going on within a group than try to have some general equation where you're homogenizing all the historical processes. That's all I have to say. The racial state has been, of course, every bit as hostile toward reparations as have white citizens. Many of you will remember in 2000, for example, the State Department resisted any language in the meetings that led up to the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, that labeled slavery or the slave trade a crime or a crime against humanity. This is a bipartisan agreement and hostility. During the 2004 presidential campaign, John Kerry labeled the issue of reparations as divisive. According to political scientist Charles Henry, Democratic member of Congress Tony Hall reported receiving more hate mail than for any other issues when he introduced an apology resolution in 1997. Much earlier in the discussions immediately following World War II and the founding of the United Nations, the United States delegation, led by liberal hero Eleanor Roosevelt, fought the NAACP, and particularly Du Bois and more radical black activists, to guarantee that the new Human Rights Declaration could not be used by blacks to make human rights claims before the United Nations. Black oppression, to challenge black oppression in the US. In addition to the Western colonial powers, the US found an ally in the Soviet Union, who also did not want human rights claims from being made within its own borders against the state. U.S. often fought very hard against any acknowledgement of broad claims with respect to Jim Crow and slavery, although occasionally issuing more limited apologies, such as a Senate's apology for refusing to act on lynching, or President Clinton's sort of apology to Africa for the slave trade. As Allison Harris and I detail in our forthcoming chapter on reparation, there's also substantial opposition to the concept of reparations or even reparative justice on the left, as it's considered too divisive an issue, as well as a distraction from so-called real issues of economics inequality and exploitation. Of course, the concept of reparative justice is far more inclusive than that of reparations. A reparative justice campaign would be based on a process of discussing and acknowledging democratically the harm that the American system of racial subordination, oppression, expropriation, and super-exploitation inflicted on blacks during slavery, Jim Crow, and into our era. But a full reparative justice on race campaign would not be limited to black oppression or to the U.S., but would within the U.S. and globally have to address questions of dispossession, expulsion, conquest, and genocide, as well as the slave trade, slavery, and the subsequent regimes of oppression. A regimes of articulation approach would encourage us to think about not only just dismantling of white supremacy, but how the economy and basic institutions such as the family would have to be reorganized to eliminate the expropriation and oppression generated within capitalism and patriarchy and white supremacy, and that is generated by their articulation to each other. Such a campaign would also debate the proper steps that this society should undertake to repair the devastation that result of these racist systems. Unlike reparations, however, there would be no necessary assumption of what the end would be. After a society-wide process of education, debate, and political contestation, remedies can include any, all, or none of the following: truth and reconciliation hearings, symbolic changes to monuments and other embodiments of history and memory, restoration of claims of sovereignty, universal programs to aid all, and or targeted programs that target blacks and other people of color currently disadvantaged by racial subordination. The point is that a reparative justice campaign would not rule in or out any specific remedies. It would insist on discussion and acknowledgement of the harms done in the past, their current legacy, and the continuing harm that these articulated systems of domination produce in the present. A social democratic or socialist state will have massive incentives to resist claims for reparative justice, whether they originate in the processes of dispossession, slavery, or conquest. This is the optimistic part, sort of. Let's assume that 10 to 20 years from now, a social democratic majority governs at the national level in many of the states and most urban areas. While perhaps unlikely, this scenario is no longer unthinkable. If for the purpose of this discussion, we bracket the effects on the most undemocratic national institutions such as the Senate and the courts, it will still be the case that 10 to 20 years from now, it's quite likely that many Americans, according to our data, particularly white Americans, will strongly resist efforts of redress, including even apologies. A social democratic regime would need to resist the very strong incentives, either reject or put on the back burner a strongly distributed program of restorative justice. As political theorist Robert Meister argues extensively in his book After Evil, and his forthcoming work, Historical Justice, there is a moral imperative, of course, to address historical injustice. Politically within the U.S., successful progressive movements have always relied on the most militant populations, almost always people of color. As we know from recent polls, the only population within the U.S. where there is majority support for socialism today is the black population. Racial injustice must be confronted not only to heal wounds of the past in the name of justice, not only in order to dismantle one of the central pillars of the capitalist social order, white supremacy, but also to mobilize communities most supportive of not just dismantling white supremacy, but also an out-of-control and rapacious capitalist social order. Get this right this time. So, complicating these questions even further, is that some of those who are justly concerned with the catastrophic effects of climate change, not only on human populations, but on the entire planet, are demanding a policy of zero growth or severely limited growth, especially from global north policies such as the U.S. that have historically and in this period have been the main source and beneficiaries of the devastating assault on our planet. I had a conversation with some young activists of color about 2 years ago, and they were asking what would black and brown people think about a zero growth policy. I said, I can't speak for black and brown people. That's the first thing out of my mouth always. But I said, analytically, I would think that you would have to accompany a zero growth program with some idea about how restorative justice claims would be met. But there's good reasons why zero growth or limited growth demands are being made. Climate change has already reached catastrophic levels and is on the verge of being irreversible. The human emphasis, especially under capitalism, on domination of the planet is a massive part of the problem, and it's led to continuing accumulation on the rubric of growth that is a justification for the massive attack and expropriation of nature itself. As Nancy Fraser's argued, the environment is a necessary abode for the functioning of capitalism, and the global north should be targeted as a matter of justice and be particularly scrutinized. Questions of historical justice are central to considerations of the environment as well as that of racial and other forms of subordination and expropriation. Thus, the demand for zero growth or severely limited growth for the global north is seen as a matter of both justice and survival for many activists. Zero growth demands, however, make the possibility of reparative justice as a justice, even under social democratic regimes, more difficult pragmatically, fewer resources, and politically, intensification of the fight over resources during a zero growth regime. Redressing the environmental predations of capitalism has to be a priority. Balancing these priorities politically, morally, and pragmatically will be a daunting challenge to future socialist or social democratic regimes. How should we think about these conflicts? We need to remember that processes of dispossession, genocide, the slave trade and slavery, and environmental degradation and spoilage are all tied together historically and to some degree theoretically. Historically, for example, profits from the slavery in the 70s and 70s covered 1/3 of British gross fixed investment needs, according to Foster and Clark in their 2018 article, The Expropriation of Nature. Accompanied by dispossession, genocide, and the brutal ecological ravages of plantation economies, quote, the extreme expropriation of the earth in combination with the slave system and imperialism provided the wealth and raw materials spurring the development and expansion of industrial capitalism, unquote. They make clear elsewhere in the article, but I want to emphasize here that under the rubric of imperialism, they include, as I, the dispossession and genocide of indigenous people in Africa, Oceania, and the Western Hemisphere. As Lisa Lowe, Iko Dave, Foster and Clark, and others make clear, Asia was to be pulled into the global pattern of expropriation, particularly after the abolition of slavery in the Western Hemisphere led to an importation of Asian labor that operated in conditions akin to those of slavery itself. Theoretically, expropriation is a key phenomena that links these processes together. As they argue in their article, Foster and Clark say that in today's phase of globalized monopoly finance capital, characterized by secular stagnation in the capitalist core, planetary ecological crisis, and the rise of neoliberalism as a system of financialized redistribution, relations of expropriation have further asserted themselves to the point that the systems seems at times to have entered a period of forcible dissolution of everything in existence, an age of structural crisis and exterminism extended to the web of life itself, unquote. As Nancy Fraser explains, this cycle has intensified in this period as, quote, the current neoliberal phase has inaugurated a new round of enclosures, the commodification of water, for example, which are bringing the more of nature, if one can speak that way, into the economic foreground. Against a background of global warming, this assault on what remains of the ecological commons is turning the natural condition of capital accumulation into another central node of capitalist crisis, unquote. Yet struggles against these multiple forms of expropriation and exploitation have been to some degree separated in practice due to an overemphasis on exploitation, the condition of a largely white male Euro-American working class, not to be confused by what many of us in the 20th century call the super exploitation of workers of color, which combine exploitation and expropriation. Expropriation lies at the core of white supremacy, patriarchy, and also the roots of environmental degradation and disaster. And it denigrating by all too many members of the left on any struggle not tied to a narrowly defined version of exploitation. To fight environmental depredation, one must take on white supremacy, both globally and within the U.S. Areas, as we heard yesterday, populated by those labeled inferior and or uncivilized are often recipients of toxic waste, whether through as literally the dumping grounds for toxic garbage or through the racist siting of industrial enterprises that produce poisonous byproducts. We have to consider other forms of growth outside of the system of financial capital we have now. We ought to be considered in a world not driven by mindless accumulation and the expropriation of nature. Another approach, well, let's see how much time. There's another approach that I was going to talk about, but I'm going to skip over. We could talk about it in question and answer, but the short version is that Bob Meister is talking about the need to hold financial capital, to have them pay the same type of price for social peace that industrial capitalism paid the left in social democracies during the 20th century. One small, or actually massive, set of figures might make the point. During the bailout of 2008, the U.S. government transferred $800 billion of cash essentially to the financial institutions. More than that, the U.S. government guaranteed $17 trillion worth of assets. Now, economists, mainstream economists, people that work in places like the Freeman Becker Institute on my campus, actually realize that since these are public funds that are publicly allocated, Financial capital should be paying a price for peace. They're not. But anyway, we can talk more about possible strategies to secure such a degree for liquidity, as Meister puts it. Let me conclude with a few concluding thoughts. We must address the claims of those that suffered expropriation, dispossession, expulsion, conquest, genocide, and slavery. We must tackle the difficult questions of how reparative justice campaigns, for example, centered on black social movements and claims of sovereignty that emerge from indigenous movements, complement and or clash with each other, but also with the ending of the expropriation of nature. Over the past few years, I have emphasized using an approach of pragmatic utopianism, an approach rooted in black radical traditions. Utopian because we do not allow our imaginations to be fettered by ruling notions of the possible when we consider what type of world we must build so we have a chance to flourish. Pragmatic because we need strategies and tactics based on a rooted understanding of the conditions as they are and a hard-headed analysis of how we get from where we are to where we desire. Usually I emphasize the utopian side, to break through the neoliberal shackles of common sense so that we can imagine the communities within which we want and need to live in, within which we all have an opportunity to be fulfilled. But you also have to emphasize the pragmatic aspects of politics and, yes, economics. Not as defined by the narrow disciplines that are not only captured by neoliberalism, but in large part responsible for the neoliberal turn. Pragmatic in the sense that we have to think through what form of politics and economics takes when we think about the social design of democratic institutions that can justly account for, and if need be, adjudicate between claims that, if you're not careful, become conflicting, even if they're not inherently so. Thank you. Oh, wait.
It's right under here.
Oh.
Okay.
I should get some water. I'll get some. Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Okay. I have a bad tendency to wander around. So, questions? Oh, only one. Cheryl.
Taking your, what I think excellent point about disaggregating questions of sort of opinion, I wonder if in your study, or if anybody is studying the question of indigenous reactions to questions of reparations, or apologies for slavery, or is anybody taking?
Yeah. So the short answer is I'm not aware, at least within political science and political psychology, of people doing that work. And I can speak to 2 or 3 reasons, all that speak to past and current injustice. One is not enough scholars, indigenous scholars, are in these programs. There's no mistake that my generation was the first generation to start doing black surveys. And that my students were some of the first ones to do surveys of Asians in the United States. So that's one reason. Scholars have not turned to it. But a bigger problem that all of us face who try to do this type of work is funding, and the National Science Foundation. The study that on black ideology that I did was not funded by the National Science Foundation. I've never had money from the National Science Foundation. Studying blacks are only 10% of the population. They tell us nothing about the big problems facing the United States. So we have to be somewhat entrepreneurial when we mount these studies, and we need to be able to answer questions like that. There's also respectability politics among people of color, too. So, for example, when I was an assistant professor at Michigan, we wanted, a very famous scholar at Harvard was talking about black anti-Semitism. And some of us were skeptical about to what degree black anti-Semitism was a thing. But we were told we couldn't put it on the survey by senior black scholars because we didn't want to know the answer. They said, yes, we do want to know the answer. We want to know the answer regardless of what the answer is. We might not like the answer, but we need to know the answer. That's a seek truth from facts thing that I've been trying to. But the short answer is that we don't know yet. We need to know. And not knowing those type of answers to those type of questions led to many of the conflicts in the past, and could certainly will cause future conflicts in the future.
Thank you, Michael. So I have a question about how you conceptualize the questions that you ask in surveys. You know, we all know that we find the answers to the questions we ask. And how and to what extent have you actually kind of manipulated the wording of the questions to see if you get different responses? And related to that, how do you think about the distinction, which I think is pretty profound, between political demands and moral claims? Because so much of discourse about reparation is couched, even if we're talking about money, is couched in moral claims, not political demands. So that's what I'd like to hear you think about.
Okay. I'm going to do the easy question first. Not now. Stop that. Bad. So I'm only being slightly facetious when I said it during, I think it was in the 1990s or early 2000s, that I could produce among either blacks or whites any percentage I wanted for or against support for affirmative action, depending on question, wording, context, etc. So, and we also know through many studies that responses are also sensitive to the gender, to the perceived race of the interviewer, etc. So we try to think about both the context in which the survey is being conducted and then about what type of, well, the context, I'll start there. So for example, when I was at Michigan, I had two senior colleagues who did public opinion, one black, one white. The black one said never use white interviewers because black people will always lie to white people. And the white senior colleague, who's very famous in the race and politics community, said never use black interviewers because black people just want to look good in front of other black people. And I said, I'm not getting tenure. But there's a germ of truth in that. Some more sophisticated studies have shown that not only do responses vary, let's say with race of interviewer, but how people think about a question varies with whom they're talking to. So when I was doing Black Visions, we did a couple of things which we tried to think were reasonable practices for the time. One is in terms of question formation, we went back to like the Kampami Women's River Statement, we went to the platform of the Black Panther Party, we went to original documents out of the movement to say, this is not what I think black nationalism is. This is what black nationalism of a certain site said black nationalism was. And they try to write questions that fit that. Not always successfully. It's very hard to boil some of these very sophisticated concepts down to a survey question, but we did what we could. The other thing we said is, what type of conversation are we trying to have? So some people, one way to get around the first problem, some people say you should always randomize race of interviewer. And we said, no, what we're actually interested in, how do black people talk about politics when they're talking to other black people? And so we had all black interviewers, which almost worked. And the reason I said almost is that we had one of these bureaucratic problems that actually ended up with new scientific information. The Survey Institute at Michigan decided they didn't want to do it anymore for some reason, so we had to go outside and get another Detroit firm. And we found out there were differences in responses based on whether people had been trained by the University of Michigan or by the black firm. The University of Michigan black interviewers were perceived more often as white than the ones trained by the black firm. So you have to be careful. But the question we ask is, what type of conversations, we know conversations change depending on who you're talking to, what type of conversations are we interested in, then try to build the survey. What type of questions are people talking about within the community? We did lots of testing informally with all sorts of black folks, and that's how we built it up. Political demands versus moral demands. So what I would probably argue now, and this is something I'm still thinking through, which is why I'm pausing, that we always have to have the moral demands and the questions of injustice always in front of us. But part of the pragmatic part is thinking about what political demands best get us to the moral ends we want to accomplish at a given time. So that's how I tend to approach it. As you know, it's not easy when you're actually doing work. But I don't think we can ever lose, and I think there has been times where we've lost our moral compass. But that doesn't mean that we don't make political choices. We have to make political choices. We don't have a choice.
Thanks for your talk. It gives us lots to think about. I have a related question, which is from a couple of slides ago, which was the question around the apology towards slavery. And so I was looking at your numbers. There's that dip that happens in 2017 with the Asian American category, which is almost a 16-point dip. Yeah, that one. So I'm curious, just taking it back to the moral political demands, how do we think about that turn from 2010 to 2017? Because one way you can read those numbers is through presidential politics, right? So 2008 to 2016, you've got basically a particular kind of politics happening. And then if we're to read that dip after the 2016 election, does that tell us something about the Trump campaign, the anti-black, anti-immigrant, anti-everything, right? But what does that tell us about future political demands? I'm just curious about that dip.
I'm not sure. And I'm not sure for a couple of reasons. One is very much methodological. The 2017 data is from a different source than the data before. It's from a UCLA study that a lot of us contributed questions to. We did not actually do did not have control over the methodology that was used to do the survey. Second is it's one time period. There's another question that I've done a lot of work with, asking about, do you expect blacks to achieve equality within your lifetime? That's where the title of the book comes from. And it starts off in the 90s as saying, 2/3 of blacks saying, not in my lifetime or never at all inside the United States. And by 2005, it's up to 80%. And then for 2008, black people get optimistic. I don't know why. I haven't figured it out. I'm from Chicago. I wasn't very optimistic. But it rapidly grows back up. And in fact, what's even more stunning is Latinx pessimism rises even more sharply during that period than black. And there's lots of things going on in terms of immigration struggles right after between 2008 and 2010. So I want to see what 2018, 2019, 2020 look like before I can say anything about that number. What gives me a little bit of confidence is that when we look at other items from that survey, we see a really, and we haven't seen this necessarily in the 5 to 10 years earlier, we see a really sharp break between Latinx, black, and Asian populations and white populations. It was much more mixed in, let's say, 2008 to 2010 or even earlier. So to what degree this is lasting, we don't know. We obviously know there are questions where there's interethnic conflict, but there's some indication that the shift, it may not be durable, but it may be real, at least for the moment.
Thank you very much for your talk and sharing your research and wisdom with us. I had 3 interrelated questions. You talked about your interest in technology in general, at the beginning of your talk, and I'm just curious to know how you would relate that to all that you shared with us in such detail, specifically that the issues of race and the issues of domination exist globally, and I'm just curious with the technology how you see the trends unfolding in terms of us communicating with each other, mobilizing with each other. The second, which is related, thank you for engaging us in the environmental crisis. And so there's a lot of discussion about the environmental debt. And of course, poor people, people of color, suffer first and much more severely. So curious about how your research team might be addressing that in terms of the debt owed to us who are suffering most and who have contributed the least. And so that piece, I think, thank you for that, because that needs to be much further on the screen. And finally, in terms of university reparations, the Center for Reparations Research just emerged at the University of West Indies at the backing of Hilary Beckles. And so you might be aware of the work with the University of Glasgow saying that, yes, slavery actually has supported us in our existence. And so now the University of the West Indies and the University of Glasgow just asking what you might be able to draw from that in terms of University of Chicago or any lessons. So, thank you.
Okay, I want to do the last one first. And I'm tempted to say turn off the recorder. I don't know if this is true, but one of my colleagues said that the University of Chicago is the only university where there's been claims of ties to slavery that has not acknowledged those claims. What is very clear, the university has a very conservative, usually it does everything it can to copy Harvard, Stanford, Princeton et al. It's not doing that with respect to the effort to try to departmentalize, for example, comparative racial and ethnic studies. So when particular issues of race, but in terms of economics, we know about the University of Chicago economics history and the legacy of people like Milton Friedman in places like Chile. It's a very conservative university. It's one of those places that it reminds me of Du Bois. Evidence is not going to persuade them. The only thing that's going to persuade them is political power. Mobilized, militant, angry political power, probably coming from outside the university, will be the only thing that might get a change in policy on reparations at the University of Chicago. Now, those of us working on that should be building ties to the University of West Indies and University of Glasgow and our colleagues at Georgetown and elsewhere within the U.S. working on these issues. But we have a formidable group of administrators to deal with. I'll try to keep it polite. I'll talk a little bit about the technology side. It's something that I'm trying to bring. For a while, it was sort of separate part of me. After I was an activist, student activist, I dropped out of school for 10 years. When I talk to my students, I say, do as I say, not as I do. And do as a union organizer, community and student organizer in various places around the Bay Area and California. But I worked in Silicon Valley. I originally thought I was going to be a physicist or an engineer, so I always liked the technical geek stuff. But what I've been teaching for the last several years is a course on democracy and the information technology revolution, and trying to adjudicate claims that to what degree are the new technologies, information and communication technology on one hand, enabling certain forms of solidarity, public building, and the like, and to what degree are they being used as they were in the Middle East and elsewhere for surveillance, oppression, repression, and the like. I won't review, and one of the things that Meister does, because at Santa Cruz, is he's working with a lot of radical technologists to think about how technology such as blockchains can be used as a way to fund and finance progressive movements. So there's a very geeky fantasy series that you say, can you use the weapon of the enemy to liberate yourself, to paraphrase. I'm trying to obscure the source. I don't want to really out myself on this one. And sometimes, yes, but I don't think we've paid enough attention, particularly with respect to systems of white supremacy, of the role that technology is playing both for and against liberation. Now, in terms of the environmental justice, that's been a piece that has been missing from my work. I'll just say it, since until about a month or two ago. But one reason that was always in the back of my mind is that my late partner was, as my children tell me all the time, Dad, you were the conservative, Mom was the radical. Man, whatever. But one of the things she did in the last years of her life was she continued to be anti-capitalist, and for, she was from Hawaii, and for the liberation of people of color throughout the world. But she became an environmental justice activist, working with groups on the south side of Chicago that are trying to combine fights against white supremacy and fights for environmental justice. And so I think, and living in Chicago with the type of extremes of weather that we're seeing, and whether, I've spent years in California, you can't go anywhere without thinking about the crisis of water. The fact that the Russian, Canadian, and US navies are fighting over a Northwest Passage, so that a new Cold War that might be very hot is developing in the Arctic, because now you can do what the European explorers wanted to do hundreds of years ago and sail across the north to get from Europe to Asia. So we have to integrate it. We have to understand it. People like me don't. But I think, to go back to what Ruthie said, it's both a moral and political imperative that we do so.
Thanks. So, you kind of spoke a little bit to one of my questions already, but talking more about the political choices that we have to make, and also the conflicting claims of just claims that exist. So how do we manage the long history of dispossession in the face of pursuing restorative justice, and those conflicting claims that are just in the face of the environmental crisis? So if you could talk more about what you're thinking on that. And again, also talking more about doing this work in the academy and what that means as a political choice, and what your thoughts are, having both worked out of the academy and within it, and continuing to do so. Thanks.
Well, I think a couple of things. I'm going to start with your last question first, because it's probably the one I've thought about more in some ways, is that those of us who are privileged to have secure jobs within the academy, that's certainly not everybody in this room, but it's certainly, I would say that relatively recently describes my position, have a responsibility to provide resources, not just for our students and others who want to pursue these avenues, but also to work as closely as we can on the questions that movements are generating with people in communities. And most of my students and many of my colleagues still remain activists. So I don't, to the degree that one of the worst things that happened to the black movement was the neoliberalization of black studies. A few of us in this room were there at the beginning. Black studies came from the streets. It didn't come from the academy. When it came to the academy, it came with the ideal of black liberation at its center. It was often anti-capitalist. Unfortunately, it was also often very patriarchal and homophobic. But that was contested too, at least on the campuses that I was at. But the professionalization, the disciplinarian side of the academy has turned black studies into something that is, while very recognizable, is very much the antithesis of what it was meant to be at the beginning. So one of the things that we're trying to do, for example, with the race and we were talking on the way over yesterday. A lot of administrations look at the more progressive race centers, and a lot of them have very senior and well-respected scholars, and trying to figure out how can we keep the reputation and get rid of the politics. And they're doing that at the University of Chicago. And what was that done is something they probably haven't figured out. Kathy Cohen has a group. I have a group. So we keep moving so that you keep to avoid being shut down and to keep the political side going. Also, I would say, I'm going to sound sort of old-fashioned for a second. There's also division of labor. I'm not that good at interviewing people. I'm very good with playing with things in front of computer screens. So within a movement, there's a division of labor as well. It's not that one type of labor is better than the other, but it's that people are better at different things. And sometimes, for some people, working within the economy is the best way to contribute to the movement. In terms of the question about how do these questions, for example, of dispossession and genocide get reconciled with some very different types of demands around that were rooted in commodification of black bodies, for example. They're not going to be worked out in the academy. I'm not going to have answers for those. They're going to be worked out in practice and in struggles and communities. We can think about, one of the things that I can do, and I've tried to do, is talk about how those things went wrong, how those type of debates went wrong in the past. What type of intra-movement identity politics, for example, was manipulated by various university administrations to put black and brown students against each other. But in terms of what solutions come, that has to come out of all practice, out of movements. Just one aside, we've had a lot of wonderful conversations, and one of the things that keep coming up is I'm very tired of people my age trying to impose 20th century solutions on the 21st century. It doesn't even make any sense intellectually. The economy's not the same. I don't know what the point of production looks like. It's not in Detroit. One of the things I think people of my generation can do is tell people our age to back down, move aside, let people understand this generation, this economy, this set of problems, take the lead. Time to relinquish leadership.
Hi, I only caught the tail end of your talk, but I was actually just really interested in what you meant about or I guess I understand what you mean about the neoliberalization of Black studies, but in your mind or in your imagination, what would have been a better way? Or what can we do to kind of move towards a better vision of integration of Black and ethnic and all sorts of minority studies in the way that they're not commodified or seen as that's the end goal, that's not our final accomplishment?
Right. So I think one thing we can do, the work of my colleague in the project at the University of Washington, Megan Francis, talks, for example, about how the NAACP in a paper she did was moved away from working on criminal justice after it won some major victories because of a grant from a foundation that was specified, despite the NAACP's leadership protestation, only for education. That happened in Black studies too. The Ford Foundation, among others, led the way in funding and professionalizing Black studies departments. And part of it, there's a lot of reasons. People, I think Ruthie said yesterday, I can't talk about individual choices, I can talk about conditions. But some of the conditions of the academy are that you do need to get tenure. My first book is not the book that I would have wanted to write first. Or to put it a different way, it was severely limited in what I said. I didn't write anything in my first book that I disagree with. So in that sense, I stand by it. But there's a whole lot more I could have said that I didn't say. And I was writing for tenure. It was very, very simple. That's a structural fact of life for those in our business. For some people, that's not a goal that they particularly worry about. But I also have students who are adjuncting, teaching 12 courses because they don't have a permanent position while they're trying to do their activism as well. So part of it is trying to think about how can we nurture young scholars in ways that allow them to be who they want to be in terms of politically and continue their activism and ties to communities, while at the same time providing environments that their professional careers can develop. If not necessarily at some prestigious university, but at some place where they can get the work they want done. Most of my students, I have a relatively good placement rate of doctoral students. Almost none of them get placed in political science. Gender studies, ethnic studies, black studies, Chicano studies. Very few get placed in political science.
If I can add a caveat to what you said about your generation, which I think might be my generation. Norman Gervin is an incredible political economist at the University of West Indies. He was honored a few years ago, and he was standing at the podium. And he said, the greatest thing about this conference is that my son is also presenting at this conference, who's in his 20s. He says, and there is nothing that makes me happier. And he gave this story. He says, I got a baton in my hand, and I'm running. I'm still running with you guys. I'm running. Now keep on running, because I got some stories to tell you, and I know you're ready. And I just need you to be here with me, and so I'm ready to pass this off. So that intergenerational piece is really, really critical. You just addressed it right now. How do we create these spaces for young people? I'm still running, y'all, and so I got the baton, and let's go.
I'm limping, but that's okay.
And you're still running. You're still running by sharing this with us. So thank you.
The intergenerational piece, you're absolutely right. The person that got me involved, or that annoyed him sometimes, was Sinclair Drake. He used to bring a bunch of activists into his home and tell us about how they organized the student strike at Hamptons in the 1920s, about what they were doing in the Merchant Marine during World War II, about the problems about Nkrumah getting too drunk at this time, how Padmore was an idiot. I mean, it was like all the type of gossip and fun, but it was also lessons about how to live a life as an intellectual activist. And so the intergenerational piece, and he was still producing, but he was brought into Stanford to found black studies and put down the student movement. And as one of his black colleagues said, it was the worst hire Stanford ever made. He made it so that you could be a Marxist, you could be a Leninist, you could be a member of the Nation of Islam. As long as you have black liberation in your mind, we could find something for you.
Thank you again for your talk. I really appreciate it. I wanted to go back to something you said about pressure points and how they often arise during times of crises. And I would say that right now we're living in times of crises at this point in this Trump era. And so I'm wondering what pressure points would you say have revealed themselves in this current era?
That's a paper that, a little bit of that's in the Shelby paper, but a lot of it is in papers we're working on. And I think part of what we're thinking is the pressure points are always there, but they become revealed during times of crisis. Or not revealed, but become exploitable, maybe is a better way to put it, is during times of crisis. So one of the pressure points we're seeing now is that two things are going on simultaneously, more than two, but I'm picking out two. One is that real wages, standard of living for most Americans have been falling, regardless of race, for quite a long time, either stagnant or falling. So the bargain that many members of the working class, particularly the white working, but not exclusively the white working class, made, that you'll have social peace if you at least maintain a mild illusion of social mobility and rising standards of living, combined with keeping certain populations of color in their place and maintaining a patriarchal norm. All of these things are being undermined. And so what you have is a situation where, at least amongst conflict, this is not unlike Weimar Germany, where you have conflicting pressures of, we have economic pressures that may push us toward a progressive solution, may not, but may, but also with a need to try to restore a type of make America great again that's based on homophobia, patriarchy, and the suppression of all peoples of color. So that's the pressure point. And the reason I say it's contingent is that who can organize those types of, I mean, at the same time, you have other types of pressures building up within black, brown, indigenous communities at the same time. They're not the same, but they have some of the same sources in terms of capital crisis and crisis of legitimacy in parts of the population. The Communist Party could have won in Germany in the 1930s. That's a foreseeable outcome. It didn't. Hitler did. So what happens here, what happens in Hungary, what happens in the UK, what happens in France with the Yellow Jackets is to be determined and is highly contingent. We are in a point where those type of frictions are generating possibilities for the left and the right.
Hi, thank you. My name is Beth. I have a very practical question. I appreciate your description of pragmatic utopianism. I think of myself as a pragmatic skeptic, and the data shows that beauty wins. And in terms, one of the things that's necessary is to find the non-normative narratives. So I'm not surprised when I hear classist, racist, ableist bullshit, but I am inspired when I see the narratives that are not that. So to your data here, where, and this will be easy because they're all your friends, as you said, but for the white folks or folks who would be perceived to not benefit directly for an apology for slavery or for reparations, it sounds like you didn't just have yes or no boxes, but that you had some level of descriptive. I'm wondering, what are some of the narratives that people were using to say, well, and this is why I think this is a good idea, though I officially would not be perceived as seeming to, quote, benefit from it. Thank you.
So one of the things I can say fairly confidently that the best predictor of support for reparations or apology across racial and ethnic groups is whether you believe racism to be a major problem or not. And that varies. I mean, it's not the only factor. For some groups, it's to what degree are you embedded within community groups. For other groups, it's to what degree you see there's common problems. But one of the most powerful predictors across the board is do you perceive black folks to, if racism is a major problem, what do you think the prospects are for black equality? And in the 1990s, we did a survey, several of us at several universities, that was sort of like, you call it Du Bois survey, because it was like, what's the factual knowledge about race and immigration in the United States? And it was a disturbing study, one type of studies that, actually this study another similar study led the sociology major survey, general social survey, to be terminated for a year because Congress didn't like the results. But one of the set of patterns we saw in the 1990s was that white Americans believe that blacks have lower rates of higher incomes, lower rates of unemployment, have better health outcomes, etc. We also found that people thought that the level of immigration was so high that 80% of the country would be immigrants if those rates actually held. So it was like extraordinarily factually just wrong about, I could come up with a more, that's the most precise word I can come up with. The worlds that people are, so the way I put it is that black people disagree with each other, black people and Asians have disagreements, but we sort of see the same world. Now, we might disagree about what we should do about it or how we think about whether it's a good or a bad world, but we see the same world. But particularly when it comes to African Americans or white Americans, we don't see the same world. We see totally different worlds. And that means that there's a great suspicion between the two communities because, oh, you said what? That's not true. But it goes in both directions. So one of the political problems we have to solve is how do we get people at least to see the same world, so then we can debate about what to do and what's right or wrong. But if you don't see the same world, there's very, to use a German phrase, very little basis for rational communication. Okay.
We can continue with the questions in the... So much.
Thank you.